Probably the best known free market economist, at least in this country, is Milton Friedman. Friedman had various disagreements with the Austrian tradition on various points, obviously things like monetary theory and the causes of depressions and business cycles and so on are some of the more famous ones. But some of the disagreements were on method. I'm going to talk about two of them. I'm going to talk about the disagreement between Friedman and Mises on a priori method, something that's been touched on in some of the other lectures. And then I'm going to talk about the disagreement between Friedman and Mises and the Austrians on the issue of realism and the use of realistic or unrealistic models and that kind of thing. Thank you. Dr. Reiko quoted this famous line from Friedman on the first night, and I think it's been mentioned in at least another lecture. Since there are different versions of the quote, because Friedman has said it a number of times, but here's the one I found, where he's criticizing the praxeological a priori approach of trying to figure out necessary truths independent of experience and use that to derive economic law, as opposed to an empirical approach, which Friedman defends. So see in this passage, Friedman calls it a Karl Popperian approach. Friedman thinks of himself as working in the tradition of the philosopher Karl Popper. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about Popper in this lecture. I have another lecture this afternoon where I will say more about Popper. I think that Friedman is right that the kind of criticism he's giving of Friedman is something like of Mises is something like the kind of criticism that Popper would probably give of Mises. I don't think Friedman was. I think Friedman's version of Popperianism was fairly crude compared to Popper's own views. I still think that Popper was wrong on this kind of issue, but I think Friedman's more wrong. But anyway, so here's the famous passage. If you and I are both praxeologists, and we disagree about whether some proposition or statement is correct, how do we resolve that disagreement? We can yell, we can argue, we can try to find a logical flaw in one another's thing. This is something he said in an interview, not written, so this is, just don't think that Friedman is an incompetent prose stylist here. We can try to find a logical flaw in one another's thing, but in the end we have no way to resolve it except by fighting, by saying you're wrong and I'm right. On the other hand, if you take more like a Karl Popperian approach, I say to you, what facts can I find that will convince you I was right and you were wrong? Then we go out and observe the facts. That's how science progresses. So Friedman is thinking, if you take an empirical approach, if you regard your propositions as empirically testable, then we have a way of resolving conflicts. I ask you, all right, what do you regard as empirical evidence for your view, and what would you regard as empirical evidence against it? This is sort of the particularly Popperian point. What would you regard as empirically refuting your view? What would it take empirically for you to give up your view? And then I, if I'm a good Friedmanite, will tell you what I would regard empirically as refuting my view. And then we go out and look. We test. So suppose I've got some theory about business cycles, and you've got an opposite theory about business cycles, and so, my theory predicts that, if there was a Great Depression, then the Fed must have been increasing the money supply prior to that, and your theory doesn't predict that. So then we go and look and see what the Fed was doing, and and one of our theories will be corroborated and will be disconfirmed. So if each side will tell what they would grant as empirical evidence refuting their view, then Friedman thinks is a basis for reaching agreement. Whereas if instead we take our theses as being a priori, it's based on conceptual reasoning rather than empirical investigation, then Friedman thinks that there's no way to resolve it, because there's no empirical test that will settle the issue. There's no empirical evidence you can point to that will make me give up my theory, and there's no empirical evidence I can point to that will make you give up your theory. And so Friedman thinks that disagreements will be intractable if you take the a priori method, and they won't be intractable if you take the empirical method. Well, as some previous thinkers have asked, and some previous speakers have asked, why is it that doing what Friedman calls trying to find a logical flaw in one another's thing, why is that necessarily intractable? Just as it's possible for me to go and look for empirical evidence against your view if you're giving me an empirical thesis, so if you're giving me a thesis based on a priori reasoning, it's possible for me to try and look and find some mistake in your a priori reasoning. Now, of course, maybe you'll just resist, and no matter what I say, you will just say no, and you'll insist your reasoning is correct. That's possible. But of course, that could happen empirically too. No matter what empirical evidence I bring you, you might always find some way of explaining it away and just sticking to your view. People can be irrationally stubborn, whether they're irrationally stubborn empiricists or irrationally stubborn praxeologists. It doesn't seem to have anything specifically to do with the methodology. If you're reasonable and open-minded and intellectually honest, then when you're giving an empirical thesis, it will be possible, to convince you that you've made a mistake with the data or you didn't look at enough data or whatever. And if you are presenting an a priori thesis, again, if you're intellectually honest, it'll be possible when you've actually made a mistake in reasoning to show you that you've made a mistake in reasoning. So why does Friedman think that it's impossible to reach any kind of agreement in the case of praxeology, whereas we can reach agreement in the empirical case? Well, it seems to me that Friedman is thinking of a priori reasoning something like this. It's as though I'm turning my mental eye inward, or I'm listening to some internal mental voice, or I'm viewing some internal glowing mental words, or something you don't have access to. I'm introspecting, I'm going inside my own private world of thought. And then I come out and I report on the deliverances of my private experience. And then you engage in a priori reasoning, and you go and you turn into your own private world of thought. And you come out and you report. It's like I've got a special cave with an oracle, and I go in and I talk to my oracle, and you go into your cave and you talk to your oracle, and then we come out and I say, well, my oracle supports the malinvestment theory of business cycles, and you say, well, my oracle supports the plucking model of business cycles, and that you can't talk to my oracle or test my oracle, and I can't talk to yours or test yours, and so we either part ways or we fight. So I think that Friedman's thinking as though a priori reasoning is something private. It's like listening to an internal mental voice, where only I can hear my voice and only you can hear yours, whereas empirical work is something public and shared. We can both go and look at the same data. We can both go and visit the same battlefield, or both go to the same archives and look through, or both perform the same experiments in the lab, or whatever. We can both go out and engage with the same empirical reality and interact with it. Whereas in a priori reasoning, we're going to do something private. We're listening to an internal mental voice. But I think that's the wrong way to think about a priori reasoning. A priori reasoning isn't a matter of consulting some private, hidden, internal oracle. And think about reasoning in mathematics and logic. Suppose that I am, that I do some calculations, and I come to you and I tell you that 3 is the square root of 12, and I didn't reach just by empirical methods. That is, I didn't count or anything. I just reasoned in my head, and I came up with the conclusion that 3 is the square root of 12. When you calculate, you don't get that result. Does that mean we have to fight, or that there's no way of resolving the agreement? No. The standards of mathematics and logic are just as publicly accessible as the standards of the empirical world. Perhaps at least as public. You can try and show me, you can lead me step by step through the mathematical reasoning and show me that 3 can't be the square root of 12. So what's leading Friedman astray here? Well, there's a way of thinking that's sometimes called psychologism, and The great critic of psychologism was the late 19th, early 20th century German logician Gottlob Frege. I'll be saying something more about him this afternoon too, for those who come to that. But psychologism was Frege's term for things that confuse psychology with logic. He thought that a lot of people were making this mistake, that they were treating logic as though it were the study of thought in the sense of being the study of how humans think. And so that statements like P implies Q really meant things like the human mind has a tendency to pass from P to Q, or that kind of thing. That logic was about the processes of human thought. And Frege thought that didn't make any sense, because if logic was just about the process of human thought, then we wouldn't be able to talk about people reasoning well or badly. We wouldn't be able to talk about logical versus illogical reasoning. Because reasoning is just however people reason. And if most people make a certain mistake in reasoning, then that becomes logic. And so Frege drew a distinction between what he called the outer realm, the inner realm, and the third realm. And the outer realm was the realm of physical objects that we can, interact with and see, and the inner realm was the realm of introspection, of sort of private thoughts and feelings. And then the third realm is what we call the realm of sort of abstract propositions and things like that. The term that's translated third realm was literally Third Reich, but Frege can't help that. He was writing before that period, although he might not have been as averse to the connection as he should have been. But anyway, he at that time, the phrase Third Reich didn't have quite the connotations it has now. But anyway, and the way he drew the distinction was this. He said that things in the outer realm are open to sense perception. We can detect them through sense perception. And they're not private. The way he put it was they don't have an owner. But when he said they don't have an owner, he wasn't denying that my watch has an owner, namely me. He meant they don't have sort of they're not sort of privately accessible to just one person. Whereas things in the inner realm, thoughts and feelings, are not perceivable by the senses, and they are private. They do have an owner, as he puts it. My thoughts are not perceivable by the senses. Not only can you not perceive my thoughts, but I can't perceive my thoughts, sense perception-wise, either. I'm aware of them in a different way, but also they're private to me. The thoughts exist just in my head, and you can't have my thoughts. But Frege said that the third realm, the realm that logic deals with, the realm of abstract propositions, not a particular thought that I recite in my head, which belongs to the inner realm, not a particular sentence that I speak or write on the board, which would belong to the outer realm, but the abstract content, so that if I say grass is green and if you say grass is green, we both have the same content. He said, well, that is not perceptible by the senses, but it's public, not private. It doesn't have an owner. I have my own inner thought, but I don't own grass is green or 2 + 2 = 4. When you think grass is green, you're thinking the very same thought that I am. You're not having the same subjective mental state that I'm having, but your thought has the same content that mine has. And it doesn't matter whether it's real grass or real green or not. And if I say unicorns can fly, even though there aren't any real unicorns, still you're thinking the same thing I am. Our thoughts have the same content. And so Frege thought there was a mistake of confusing the third realm with the inner realm. And of course, you could also confuse the third realm with the outer realm and think that logical contents are like physical entities out there. And some people think, well, maybe that's the mistake that Plato made, if he made a mistake. But you could also make the mistake that you might argue that, say, a lot of the British empiricists made, of thinking of logic as dealing with relations of ideas, understanding ideas as subjective mental contents. And so you could say, well, maybe that's the mistake that Friedman's making here, and thinking that appealing to logical principles or conceptual truths is like appealing to some, it's like appealing to some inner mental experience of yours that's private. And he thinks, well, look, the only way to resolve disagreements between people is to have some kind of public way of resolving them. And I'm going to say, well, yeah, there is. Logic, mathematics, praxeology are third realm things, not inner realm things. Now, this doesn't settle the question of what the status of these is. Are these somehow constructed or constituted by our thoughts, or do they exist independent of our thoughts? So that's an interesting philosophical question, but you don't have to resolve that in order to use this distinction. Okay, what's another a disagreement between Friedman and the Austrians? Well, Austrians often criticize economists and other traditions for ignoring realism, for having unrealistic models of the economy, leaving out, sort of trying to hyper-idealize things and leave out the facts of imperfect information and the passage of time and so forth. You get things like perfect competition, where you assume away differences in information, you assume away differences in the amount of time that it gets for people to find out things, or when you're analyzing, let's say, the effects of inflation in the economy, you ignore the fact that some people received the inflated money first and others later, and just imagine that sort of the value of everyone's money all goes up simultaneously. You explain away things like that, and Austrians often want to stress those things and say, well, look, you can't understand, if you assume perfect information, then you can't understand how the economy works. You can't understand the entrepreneurial process, or the process of arbitrage, or cases where some people are aware of some profit opportunity and other people aren't. If you don't understand the importance of the passage of time, then you're not going to understand the real effects that, say, inflation has, that it doesn't just increase lower the value of everyone's money at once, but that it systematically harms some people and benefits others, because some people get the inflated money when they're still facing the old prices, and other people don't get the new money until they've already had to face the new higher prices, and so some people get shafted more than others. In fact, there's a book by two Austrians, Mario Rizzo and Gerald O'Driscoll, called The Economics of Time and Ignorance. And the idea was that Austrian theory focuses on things like the passage of time and imperfect information, things that mainstream economics doesn't always sufficiently stress. And the line actually is a reference to a line from Keynes, so he talks about the dark forces of time and ignorance. Well, Friedman thinks that this is a mistaken criticism and that we shouldn't worry about the realism of our assumptions. And he wrote a famous article called The Methodology of Positive Economics in 1953, and it's the lead article in the book Essays in Positive Economics, which Hayek once called as dangerous a book as Keynes's General Theory. Hayek thought that two of the most dangerous books in economics were Keynes's General Theory and Friedman's Essays. And he expressed regret that he hadn't sufficiently combated either of them. There was a reason he hadn't in both cases. I mean, Keynes was his ally on the issue of inflation at that time, and they were both inflation fighters in that particular historical context, and so he didn't want to pick a fight with Keynes. At least that was the reason Hayek gave. And later on, Hayek and Friedman were obviously allies as part of a broader pro-free market movement, and so they didn't. And so Hayek didn't want to get into a fight with Friedman, but he thought that that this was a dangerous book, a dangerous article. So what does Friedman say? Well, Friedman thinks it's a mistake to complain about models being unrealistic because, says Friedman, any economic model has to be unrealistic. A perfectly realistic model would be so detailed as to be useless. You've got to abstract from the irrelevant information. And here's the quote from Friedman's article. A hypothesis is important if it explains, and believe me, those scare quotes about explains belong there, if it explains much by little. That is, if it abstracts the common and crucial elements from the mass of complex and detailed circumstances surrounding the phenomena to be explained, and permits valid predictions on the basis of them alone. To be important, therefore, a hypothesis must be descriptively false in its assumptions. It takes account of and accounts for none of the many other attendant circumstances, since its very success shows them to be irrelevant for the phenomena to be explained. Truly important and significant hypotheses will be found to have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality. And in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. A theory or its assumptions cannot possibly be thoroughly realistic in the immediate descriptive sense so often assigned to this term. A completely realistic theory of the wheat market would have to include not only the conditions directly underlying the supply and demand for wheat, but also the kind of coins or credit instruments used to make exchanges, the personal characteristics of wheat traders, such as the color of each trader's hair and eyes, his antecedents in education, the number of members of his family, their characteristics, antecedents, education, etc., the kind of soil in which the wheat was grown, its physical and chemical characteristics, the weather prevailing during the growing season, the personal characteristics of the farmers growing the wheat and the consumers who ultimately use it, and so on indefinitely. In other words, if you had a fully realistic model, you would have to include all this information, most of it irrelevant to explaining anything or predicting anything, and it would be unwieldy and unusable. So any decent model or hypothesis or theory has to abstract from a lot of that detail. It has to leave that stuff out. And of course, the more it leaves out, the more unrealistic you Austrians are going to complain it is. Friedman thinks. I mean, he doesn't specifically talk about the Austrians in this paper, but it's clear that they are one of the targets he has in mind. Of course, we have to abstract from these things. We have to leave them out. The purpose of economic theory is not to give an accurate description of reality. Because if it were, then the more information you included, the better a theory it would be. And so if you managed to look up who the great-great-great-great-grandfather of this particular farmer was and include that in the theory, then your theory would be even more accurate. It says, no, clearly, faithfulness to reality is not what we want out of a theory. What do we want out of it? We want a theory that will explain the results. Now, of course, one criticism an Austrian could give here, I don't think this is the most fundamental criticism to give, but it's a criticism to give, is take for granted for the moment that the way Friedman describes this is okay. I think there's a confusion in what he said here, but suppose for the moment that Friedman is fine in what he said, you could still say, all right, obviously you want to abstract from irrelevant detail. But you could complain still as an Austrian that a lot of the detail from which mainstream theories abstract is not irrelevant. For example, differences in information or facts about the passage of time are, from an Austrian perspective, crucial in explaining how the economy works. You simply will not understand how the economy works if you leave those things out. And therefore, although it's not crucial to understanding how the economy works to know who the grandfather of this farmer was, these things are crucial, and so you shouldn't leave those out. One reason that Friedman would not be impressed by that answer is that Friedman does not, by explain, Friedman does not mean what an Austrian means by it. What an Austrian means by explaining something is, there's a passage from Ludwig Lachmann that I think captures the idea, which is, he says, in economics, the purpose of economics is to make the world around us intelligible in terms of the pursuit of plans. And he also says, and to trace the unintended consequences of those plans. But we want to explain things by seeing how they are the expressions of various people trying to do things, perhaps successfully, perhaps not. But Friedman's coming out of a more positivist tradition, where explanation is primarily a matter of prediction. For Friedman, a good theory is one that makes a successful prediction. And so it doesn't matter whether the theory is true. There's you can think of a famous analogy in quantum mechanics, where I think it was Richard Feynman, I believe, who came up with a particular way of modeling something where you assume that a certain particle takes simultaneously every single one of multiple paths to its destination. And if you do that, the math all works out and you get the right predictions. And someone could say, well, does it really take all those paths? And Feynman said, I don't know. But, if you make that assumption, the theory works. So Friedman could say, look, it may very well be that if we assume things like perfect information or instantaneous transmission of information and things like that, the theory might be leaving out crucial facts about the real world, namely in the real world, people are ignorant and the time does pass. But that's not a fundamental criticism. What matters is, does this model do a good job of predicting? If it doesn't, then you're right, we've got a problem. But if the theory does do a good job of predicting, what more do you want? Explanation is really about successfully predicting things. Now, there's another response that the Austrian can make here, which again I think, again, is still assuming that everything Friedman said so far is okay. There's still a response the Austrian can make, which is something that Mises actually says about, for example, statistics, which is when we find a regularity, unless we understand what actually explains that regularity, then we won't know whether it's a short-term or a long-term regularity to be counted on. I take the following example. Suppose that before the first Lord of the Rings movie came out, I had formulated a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is, the universe contains a constant Tolkienian force that produces a Tolkien movie once every year, forever. That's my hypothesis. And then I test this hypothesis the first year, and Fellowship of the Ring comes out. And then I test it the second year, and The Two Towers comes out. And test it the third year, Return of the King comes out. And I say, cool, so far my hypothesis is corroborated. And I eagerly wait for the fourth one, and next year comes, no Tolkien movie. I'm surprised. Whereas if I had understood the real reason for you might say, well, the two theories are equally good predictors. The true explanation and my constant Tolkienian force explanation were equally good predictors for that short range of time. But because I didn't understand the real nature of the mechanism involved, I didn't know whether this would be a short-term or long-term regularity. Well, Mises makes this point about statistics. He says, yeah, you can find all sorts of regularities, but have you found fundamental laws, or have you found various temporary things? Unless you understand in terms of people's beliefs and desires what's driving this, you don't really know what sort of thing it is. So that's a possible objection you can make even if you buy Friedman's point. But I think that there is perhaps a deeper Austrian criticism that can be made of Friedman's point. It has to do with this idea that economic theory is supposed to stylize reality. It's supposed to abstract from things in such a way as to come up with a kind of an idealized model. And Mises was very much against this. And Mises thought this was one of the mistakes the classical economists made. Remember, some of the earlier lectures people talked about the fact that Mises thought that the classical economists assumed, in their theory, they assumed homo economicus. They assumed a person whose sole motive was to maximize monetary profit. The classical economists didn't believe that this was what people were really like. They were not fools. First of all, they said, well, this isn't a model of what everyone does. It's a model of what the businessman does. But they weren't fool enough to think that all businessmen are like that all the time. What they thought was enough businessmen are enough like that enough of the time that's a pretty good predictor. So the classical economists were willing to make false assumptions so long as they were good predictors of what happened. Now, I think that the classical economists were not as radically, their position was not as radical as Friedman's, because Friedman thinks the realism of the assumptions doesn't matter at all. All that matters is their predictive power. Whereas I think the classical economists would have said, well, we want the assumptions to be approximately true. They don't have to be perfectly true, but they have to be approximately true. And that's good enough so long as they're good predictors. Whereas I think Friedman would say it doesn't even matter if they're approximately true. The heck with that. When the Austrians, like Menger, come along, they criticize the classical economists for this. But Mises thought that Menger and Böhm-Bawerk had not completely freed themselves from this classical approach. Mises, in his autobiography, which is stimulatingly titled Notes and Recollections, which reminds me of some of Herbert Spencer's more stimulating titles, which include Various Fragments and I forget the other, but he wrote a bunch of books with titles like Various Fragments. Obviously, editors were not really concerned with selling these things. Anyway, Mises talks about how when he first introduced some of his monetary theory to his mentor, Böhm-Bawerk. Mises makes a big deal of the fact I mentioned earlier, that when the money supply increases, it matters who gets it first. These are sometimes called Cantillon effects or Cantillon effects for the English or the French pronunciation. The guy was both Irish and French, so you can do whichever way you like. But anyway, this is the idea that when you raise the money supply, some people get the money first, and so the fact that the money supply doesn't just automatically increase simultaneously everywhere, but trickles through the economy, creates all kinds of effects, which Mises thinks are really important. So he tried to explain this to Böhm-Bawerk, and Mises says, here's the reaction he got. Böhm-Bawerk raised no objection against the cogency of my step-by-step analysis. He did not deny its results, namely that changes in purchasing power of money cause prices of different commodities and services to change neither simultaneously nor evenly, and that it is incorrect to maintain, as Hume, for example, did, that changes in the quantity of money bring about simultaneous and proportional changes in the level of prices. But he maintained that this was a friction phenomenon. According to him, the old doctrine was correct in principle and maintains its full significance for an analysis aimed at purely economic action. In real life, there is resistance and friction, which cause the result to deviate from that arrived at theoretically. I tried in vain to convince Böhm-Bawerk of the inadmissibility of metaphors borrowed from mechanics. So what Böhm-Bawerk was saying is, look, all right, strictly speaking, it's not true that all this happens simultaneously. Just as strictly speaking, it's not true that if you hit a billiard ball with such and such a force, it'll move in such and such a direction, such and such a speed, according to Newtonian laws, because you're forgetting about the friction of the surface. And in fact, there's always air resistance and the resistance of the medium it's on, and there are various things that make things deviate. Just as if you drop a weight, it's not going to fall straight down at precisely the rate the physics textbooks say, because they're not accounting for air resistance or wind or the gravitational attraction of the moon or Sirius or you, and so on. There can be very slight deviations, but it's approximately right. And so Böhm-Bawerk was saying, look, in purely economic terms, what happens is that approximately all these things go up together, and there are deviations from that, but they're not really part of economics. The action that's involved there isn't really economic action; it's something else. It's just friction. And so we should use this approximately correct approach because it's a good enough predictor most of the time. And of course, Mises would have denied that it's a good enough predictor most of the time. Mises thinks that these effects he's talking about really are crucial to understanding important things that happen in the economy. But in any case, Mises thought that there isn't such a thing as purely economic action. That it's a certain thing that economists study, and that other kinds of action somehow don't. That sort of applies to human action generally. And so the kind of objection that the early Austrians, like Menger and Böhm-Bawerk, raised against the classicals, Mises is raising against them. Mises thinks that they haven't fully freed themselves from this approach, that they have to some extent, because you can find Menger and Böhm-Bawerk making something like this kind of criticism against the classicals, but he thinks they've made a mistake. But what is the mistake? Given that it seems like you could always go back to Friedman's point. Look, if you really think models have to be realistic, if you really want to analyze the real world and all its complexity rather than the idealized model, then you're going to have to take into account all this irrelevant stuff about the number of freckles people have and whether they're left and right-handed and whether they have a broken toenail and so on. What's the answer to that? Well, I think that Friedman is confused about the nature of abstraction. And I think that Mises was not confused about it. In fact, there's a passage where Mises is criticizing the use of ideal types in sociological analysis, where I think he's making very much the same point that I want to make here. There was a criticism that was sometimes made of abstraction, namely that it falsifies, that it treats the real world differently from what way it is. For example, suppose that I form the abstraction or the abstract concept horse. Well, does my concept apply to real horses? Well, you could ask, what color is the horse in my concept? Well, suppose it's brown. Well, then it would only apply to brown horses. It wouldn't apply to black ones or white ones or red ones. So it seems that it wouldn't be a concept of horse, it would be a concept of a brown horse. So if I really have the concept of a horse, it can't have any particular color. But then you might think, well, then it still doesn't apply to all horses. In fact, now it doesn't apply to any horses, because all horses have some particular color. Whereas my concept horse is a concept of a horse that has no color. And so now it doesn't just fail to apply to some horses, it fails to apply to any horses, because all horses really have color. So how can my concept of a horse apply to any horses at all? Because I've got this colorless horse thing, and there aren't any colorless horses in reality. So that kind of worry, do our abstractions falsify? Many philosophers have thought so. Many philosophers have thought that abstraction falsifies. In fact, that's one of the main themes in Taoism, I think, as well as various Western philosophies. Well, Plato and Aristotle were big fans of abstraction, but they handled this objection differently. Plato, in some sense, grants it. Plato thinks that nothing on earth really fully answers to the abstractions that correspond to it. That the concept table is perfectly tably in a way that no real table quite is. That every real table somehow falls short of being fully table because I could sit on it, and so therefore it's got some cherry aspects or whatever. It's not fully so that in fact all abstractions are false to some extent as they apply to the real world. And the reason that he didn't think abstractions were false straight out is he thought that abstractions do apply correctly to things in Platonic heaven. That there really is a perfect form of table. And that's what the abstraction applies to, or that in some sense just is the abstraction. Plato's view is a little more complicated than that, but at least that's a way of seeing how he handles it. Aristotle thought that was the wrong way to think about it. Aristotle thought that abstractions do not falsify, that they apply not to things off in Platonic heaven. He didn't believe in Platonic forms. He thought they just applied to ordinary things in our lives. But it's not that they and so he would say about the horse, yeah, it's true that the concept of horse doesn't include the color, and that doesn't mean that it applies to some colorless horse in Platonic heaven. It applies to real horses. It's not the concept of a colorless horse. You might say it's a colorless concept of a horse. It's a horse that doesn't include. It's a concept that doesn't include the color. But it doesn't specify the absence of color. It simply fails to specify any particular color. So we form concepts simply by focusing on certain aspects, and we leave out the others, but we don't exclude them. When I form the concept of horse, I focus on its horsey properties, and I leave out the color. But I don't specify as one of the properties in the concept having no color. If I do that, then I'm not going to get a horse out of it. Instead, I simply don't specify color, what the color is one way or another. And the medieval scholastics then developed this into a theory of two kinds of abstraction, which are sometimes called precisive and non-precisive abstraction. And basically the way to think about it is that a precisive abstraction would consider, so forming the concept of a horse, and I leave out the color, then I consider the horse as not colored. I consider the horse as not having any color. So I'm imagining a colorless horse, if you can do that. Whereas a non-precisive abstraction, I think of the horse not as colored. That is, I don't think of it as colored, but I don't think of it as not colored either. I just don't think about the color one way or the other. So here's how Thomas Aquinas puts it. And if you're familiar with Ayn Rand's theory of concepts, you can see there's a similar idea here. When Ayn Rand talks about measurement omission, she's talking about the same thing that Aquinas is talking about here. So Aquinas says, in his usual golden prose, abstraction may occur in two ways. First, we may understand that one thing does not exist in some other, or that it is separate from it. This would be precise abstraction. I can imagine a horse and imagine that color does not exist in it. I'm trying to imagine a colorless horse. Secondly, we understand one thing without considering another. That is, I think about a horse without thinking about its color one way or the other. It's the non-precise abstraction. Thus, for the intellect to abstract one from another, things which are not really abstract from one another, does in the first mode of abstraction imply falsehood. In other words, if I try to imagine a horse as not colored, I'm imagining a colorless horse, then I am imagining something's false. There's no such thing as a colorless horse. But in the second mode of abstraction, for the intellect to abstract things which are not really abstract from one another, does not involve falsehood. There's no falsehood in just thinking about a horse without thinking about color one way or the other. If, therefore, the intellect is said to be false when it understands a thing otherwise than as it is, that is so if the word otherwise refers to the thing understood. That is to say, here I'm trying to understand a horse, and I'm trying to understand it as other than it is. I'm trying to understand the horse as not colored when it's actually colored. Hence, the intellect would be false if it abstracted the species of a stone from its matter in such a way as to think the species does not exist in matter, as Plato held. But it is not so if otherwise be taken to referring to the one who understands. That is, it's not that there's an absence of color in the horse that I'm thinking of. There's just an absence of thinking about color in me. So, a theory that doesn't mention the color of the horse doesn't falsify it. And likewise, an economic theory that doesn't mention the ancestors of the farmers or how many freckles they have or whether they're left-handed or right-handed is not, that's not less realistic. It just leaves out some information but doesn't specify that that's absent. Just as saying that something is a dog is not less realistic than saying it's a chihuahua. If I say it's a chihuahua and someone else says it's a dog and someone else says it's a mammal, we're all being equally realistic. Each of us is leaving out more specific details, saying something more generic. But it's not a difference of realism. We're all equally realistic. Now, if someone said, it's a dog of no particular breed, well, that would be unrealistic, because this thing is a dog of no particular breed. But there's a difference between saying it's a dog of no particular breed and just saying it's a dog and not mentioning the breed. So likewise, with economic theory, there's a difference between saying that certain things are, simply failing to mention certain things, and saying they're absent. If I simply fail to mention facts about the passing of time and imperfect information, then my theory will still be true. It won't do a very good job of explaining because I've left out the crucial facts I need to explain it. Just like why is he chasing that cat? Because he's a dog. It makes more sense. And why is he chasing that cat? Because he's a mammal. Doesn't. So if you leave out information, then your explanation isn't going to be as good. But at least you're not saying anything false if you describe something as a mammal rather than as a dog. Whereas if you actually specify that there really is perfect information, or that perfect information really is transmitted without needing time to pass, or something like that, then you're actually saying something false. So it's not true that in order for a model to be realistic, it has to assert every truth there is to assert about the subject in question. In order for a model to be realistic, it simply has to not say anything false. So why is Friedman making this confusion? And Mises beats up on some followers of Max Weber. He thought were making the same confusion when they thought that praxeological laws were like ideal types, where ideal types are like stylized versions or idealized models of things. So the idealized type of an entrepreneur is someone who's like super entrepreneurial and doesn't do anything else. Their whole life is just alertness to profit opportunities. Austrians have no objection to the use of idealized models for certain purposes. For example, Mises' evenly rotating economy is an idealized model. It's not supposed to be accurate. But it's not supposed to be a description of reality. Rather, it's supposed to help us understand reality by seeing what would happen if certain aspects of reality were absent. So, idealized models can be useful, but they're not useful as descriptions of reality. They're useful simply for helping us understand how various sorts of things work. Well, why does Friedman make this mistake of thinking that if a model were perfectly realistic, it would have to include all this information? Well, I think that it's related to the psychologism thing again. Remember, the psychologism is the mistake of confusing the mental act of thought, which belongs to the inner realm and is private, with the content of the thought, which belongs to the third realm and is public. Now, if I'm thinking of a horse, and I'm leaving out the color, so color is absent from my mental thought of the horse, then you might think, if you confuse these two sorts of items, you might think that color has to be absent from the content in such a way that I must be thinking of a colorless horse. So I think that confusing these two kinds of abstractions is a way of confusing something that's going on in the inner realm with something that's going on in the third realm. So that in the case of non-precisive abstraction, color is absent from the act of my thinking. But in the case of precise abstractions, I'm actually removing color from the thing I'm thinking about, the object of my thought. So I think that psychologism may play a role in explaining both why Friedman misunderstands what a realistic model is, and also Friedman misunderstands the nature of a priori reasoning. Okay, questions? Yes?
Do you think it harms us as Austrians in the sense that we can't be policy advisors if we use a model other than very, very basic models?
I don't think that's the real reason that Austrians are not widely sought as policy advisors. Because you want a policy advisor who's going to let you do some of the things you want to do. But
how do you explain it to a non-economist? Succinct way without...
Well, generally, I think it's easier to explain Austrian economics to a non-economist than to explain, the models that neoclassical economists use that are often very technical, involve, lots of math where the constants and variables in the math don't actually apply to anything in the world. So I think if you're just trying to explain something to a non-economist, I don't think we are at a disadvantage, compared to the neoclassicals. But there's a former Auburn Economics grad student named James Yohe who's written a dissertation in which he argues that the popularity of the mainstream neoclassical approach, the mathematical models and the use of statistics and all that, he thinks that part of the reason for that precisely is that governments want that sort of thing because that sort of thing can be used to justify. Now, he's not saying that the economists deliberately adopted this in order to serve, government ends. Some of them might have, but he's not saying that. It's more like a selection mechanism. If the kind of thing that you genuinely want to do is the kind of thing that's useful to the government, then they're more likely to fund you. And if the kind of thing you generally want to do isn't as useful to the government, they're less likely to fund you. And so it doesn't have to be sort of an evil plot. There's always a little bit of evil plotting going on in the world, but a lot of evil in the world doesn't have to be the result of the plot. It's simply the result of certain kinds of filtering mechanisms. Yes?
You shortly mentioned the conflict of the Austrian school with the classical school. But now in the lecture we focus mainly on the different approaches between Friedman and the Austrian school. Could you shortly summarize this conflict, which is often referred to as a starting point of Austrian school economics, the conflict in Germany?
Yeah. Well, the Austrians and the classicals disagree about a bunch of things. One of the things they disagree about is that the classicals tended to favor idealized models, although they felt the idealized models should approximate to reality, and so they're in a less radical position than Friedman's. But they believed in homo economicus, and thought they were explaining sort of the activity of the businessman, whereas the Austrians, and particularly from Mises on, are trying to explain real people with their real motivations and not assuming that everyone favors monetary profit above all else. So that's one of the disagreements. They disagreed about other things, value theory, and in particular whether we analyze. Of course, by classicals, some people by classicals just mean sort of the English school, Smith and Ricardo and those guys, and would regard Say and Bastiat and those people as not classical. So other people use classical economics to mean sort of all those guys. And of course, the French economists were subjective value theorists, though not marginal, and so they weren't able to explain certain things you can only explain with marginal utility. So marginal utility is certainly one thing that distinguishes Austrians, but also, of course, neoclassicals from the classicals. But there are various things. I mean, revolution isn't just sort of one thing, but I guess subjective value, realism, and marginal utility. Those three things together certainly distinguish Austrians from a lot of other schools. You look like you're about to ask something. Yes?
Can you speak more on the personal relationships, maybe complex personality between Friedman and some of the Austrians?
Okay. There's a famous incident Friedman talks about. It's not clear whether it happened at a Mont Pelerin society. If you don't know what this is, I should probably say something about this. The Mont Pelerin Society was a society founded to promote classical liberalism, broadly understood. That meant more broadly for some of them than for others. Originally it was going to be called the Acton-Tocqueville Society, but someone said, if you're going to name this after two Catholic aristocrats, I'm leaving. So they named it after the mountain, which was not controversial, just as, Tsaritsyn named after the Tsar and was changed to Stalingrad, named after Stalin, and after both Tsar and Stalin sort of fell into disrepute, they named it Volgograd because they figured the Volga River wasn't going to come into disrepute. Anyway, there's a famous story that Friedman tells. It's not clear whether it happened at the Mont Pelerin Society or while traveling to it. There are different versions of it. But anyway, where Friedman and a bunch of his like-minded cohorts were arguing about various things and different versions of the story. We have different accounts of exactly what it was they were arguing about. When Mises supposedly got up and said, "You're all a bunch of socialists," and stormed out. And Friedman said he thinks it was absurd that anyone would call him a socialist. So there was a bit of conflict there. Friedman and Hayek got on better together, but nevertheless they were somewhat critical of each other. I mean, Hayek called Friedman's book one of the most dangerous books in economics ever written, which I think is probably criticism. And Friedman was always criticizing Hayek for being too praxeological. Now, Misesians and Rothbardians have sometimes criticized Hayek for not being praxeological enough, or for departing from praxeology more and more in his later writings. If you look at early works like The Counter-Revolution of Science, it looks fairly praxeological, but Hayek fell more into the influence of Karl Popper in some of his later writings. There's dispute as to how much of praxeology he gave up. There's dispute about how much of it he believed to begin with, lots of different interpretations. But anyway, he became more influenced by Popper later on, and a lot of Misesians have criticized him for this. But Friedman to Friedman, Hayek looked like a wild a priorist. From Friedman's standpoint, Hayek was no Popperian. Friedman used to say Hayek never really got the Misesian a priorism out of his system. He had a partial recovery, but never completely escaped from this awful influence, which, to Hayek's credit, is true. If you compare Popper with Friedman, they're both sort of semi-Popperian, but Hayek, not just in his economic conclusions, but in a lot of his methodological principles, remained much more Misesian, even if not completely so. There's a famous story where at the South Royalton Conference, where Austrian economics, the current modern version of Austrian economics, was born or reborn, and a lot of the big name Austrians were present at this conference. I forget the date. Does anyone remember the date of this David, surely you remember the date of the South Royalton Conference? Okay. 70-something anyway. Anyway, Milton Friedman came to this and announced, and this probably isn't the most welcome thing to announce at a conference that's devoted to the revival of Austrian economics. He announced there is no such thing as Austrian economics. There is only good economics and bad economics. Friedman, Rothbard was not a big fan of Friedman. You can read an article that Rothbard wrote in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, which was quite critical of Friedman, though you read what Rothbard wrote about Hayek, it was quite critical also. And there was an exchange between Friedman and Walter Block. I think that they got along personally just fine. But there's an exchange was recently published in the journal where Friedman said that Walter's positions were not those of a sane and reasonable man, but of a fanatic. Well, of course, that's something many people have said about Walter. But Friedman's position was that Walter had been criticizing Friedman for taking some excessively moderate. Of course, everyone's moderate compared to Walter, but to moderating his free market views. And Friedman said, "Well, look, I do more for free markets by moderating views and thus getting people to actually accept some part of it than you do by holding out the extreme version and thus making sure no one takes any of it." And then Walter came back and said, no, but look at these cases where you didn't actually advance it, that you have been advancing things like in the case of vouchers, where it's not that it's an inadequate step toward the good, but it actually moves to some extent away from the good, and so on. And they went back and forth until Friedman had enough. He couldn't take any more from Walter and ran away. Yes?
Two parts. In what ways does Friedman fall short of Karl Popper's method, or in what ways do they differ? And also, controlling for age, who do you think would win the fight, Mises or Friedman?
Okay, the first question, where's an example place where Friedman falls short of Popper? Well, although Friedman and Popper both think that scientific explanation should be primarily about prediction, I don't think that Popper would agree with Friedman that it's perfectly fine for your model to be descriptively false, or for you to know that it's descriptively false. I think Popper would say, if you know your model is descriptively false, then it's falsified and goodbye to it. So that's one point where I think that, and just generally, I mean, Popper has a very complex and sophisticated theory, and there's sort of the cartoon version of it you hear, but the real version is very complicated. I think Friedman, buys the cartoon version. Who would win in a fight between Friedman and Mises? Well, Mises is bigger, and most people are bigger than Milton Friedman. Mises wasn't a giant of a man, but he was bigger than Friedman, so I suppose there's a size advantage. But beyond that, I couldn't say. I've never seen either one in action. I imagine both would lose to Luthez. Yes.
Yeah, one more question. To what extent do you think is Austrian theory, like especially that of the business cycle, bound to practicological reasoning? Could we also transfer some of the insights into neoclassical models? So, to what extent do you think could there be an energetic in the future?
Well, yeah, certainly you can. There's better and worse neoclassical work, and you can have. You can incorporate a lot of the Austrian theory into the neoclassical model. Because if you do that, what you do is you make it an empirical hypothesis. Whereas if you defend in praxeological reasoning, then you show that this would necessarily have to happen given the nature of human action. But if all that they'll take is if all they'll listen to is an empirical hypothesis, then sure, you can construct a neoclassical model that's inspired by the Austrian business cycle theory. And people have done that, and that's fine. I'm not saying we shouldn't soil our hands. Time for one more question. 10, 9, yes.
Just a follow-up to that question. So would it be then possible for, as Austrians, to maintain our views, yet still try to predict a policy decision? Or would we have to start off, from a clean slate, so to speak?
I'm not sure quite understand.
Could the Austrian school accurately predict a tax policy decision?
You mean predict its results?
Right. Or would we say we don't want to get into those sorts of things?
Well, I mean, pure Austrian theory, could predict that, that the tax policy would, revenue, that prosperity or something would be lower than it would otherwise have been. It can't necessarily predict, that it'll be worse afterward than before because there might be other things operating. But often to apply praxeology, you need what Mises called thaumaturgy. You need some kind of understanding, and there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, then it's no longer apodictically certain. But Austrians can make predictions. For example, I predict that if a minimum wage were raised to $100 an hour, then unemployment would massively go up. Now, it's praxeological truth that it would be higher than it would otherwise have been. It's not a praxeological truth that it would be higher than it was before, because it could be countervailing forces. I just don't expect any of sufficient magnitude to counteract it. But that's based on the phenomenological understanding of what's going on. You can imagine that, if they massively raised the minimum wage, but at the same time, massively tinkered with the money supply to offset it, then it might not result in massive unemployment. It would just be pointless waste. Plus, there'd be the Cantillon effects. Okay, thank you.